There is a common assumption that wealth building is something visible, something that reveals itself through obvious signals like increased spending, upgraded lifestyles, or noticeable changes in behavior. Yet in many cases the opposite tends to be true, because the underlying mechanics of wealth accumulation often operate in ways that are gradual, low visibility, and structurally consistent rather than dramatic or externally noticeable. What this means in practice is that the process of building wealth is less about large, singular actions and more about small, repeated behaviors that interact with time in a way that compounds their impact, and when these behaviors are designed to operate quietly, without constant attention or external validation, they tend to integrate more seamlessly into everyday life. The first habit begins with controlled financial expansion. As income increases, there is a natural tendency for spending to expand alongside it, a process often referred to as lifestyle inflation. But in quiet wealth-building systems, this expansion is intentionally moderated, not eliminated, but slowed, so that a portion of each incremental increase in income is consistently redirected into assets rather than consumption. Over time, this creates a widening gap between what is earned and what is spent, and it is within that gap that long-term capital begins to form. The second habit involves automated allocation. Rather than relying on continuous decision-making, which can be influenced by emotion or short-term priorities, wealth-building systems often use automation to direct funds into savings, investments, or other financial structures at regular intervals, and because this process operates in the background, it reduces the need for active intervention while maintaining consistency over time. This consistency is critical because it allows compounding to function without interruption, and it removes many of the behavioral variables that can disrupt long-term progress. The third habit is subtle optimization rather than dramatic change. Instead of making large, disruptive financial decisions, individuals who build wealth quietly tend to focus on incremental improvements, adjusting spending patterns, refining allocation strategies, and gradually increasing efficiency within their financial system. And while each individual adjustment may appear small, their cumulative effect over time can be significant. This approach also reduces friction, making it easier to maintain over long periods. Another important habit is delayed signaling. In many cases, financial progress is not immediately reflected in outward behavior, which means that increases in net worth are not necessarily accompanied by visible lifestyle changes. And this delay creates space for capital to accumulate without being offset by increased consumption. It also reduces external pressures, because the absence of visible change often leads to fewer expectations or comparisons from others. The fifth habit involves maintaining liquidity awareness. Rather than focusing solely on long-term assets, quiet wealth systems often include a deliberate awareness of accessible capital, ensuring that there is sufficient flexibility to respond to unexpected changes without disrupting the overall structure. And this balance between long-term growth and short-term stability helps prevent reactive decisions that could undermine the system. The sixth habit is consistency in identity rather than intensity in action. Wealth building, when approached quietly, becomes less about occasional bursts of effort and more about maintaining a stable set of behaviors over time, and this consistency allows the system to operate predictably, reducing the likelihood of significant deviations that could interrupt compounding. When these habits are viewed together, what emerges is not a single strategy, but a system of behaviors that interact with each other, each one reinforcing the others in a way that supports gradual, sustained growth. And because this system operates without requiring constant visibility or external validation, it can continue functioning even in the absence of attention, which is one of its key advantages. From a broader perspective, this approach reflects a shift away from the idea that wealth must be actively demonstrated or constantly managed, and toward the understanding that, in many cases, the most effective financial systems are those that are structured to operate quietly in the background. This does not mean that visibility is inherently negative, but rather that visibility is not a requirement for progress, and in some cases, reducing visibility can actually enhance the efficiency of the system. Over longer periods, the effects of these habits become more apparent, not through sudden changes, but through gradual divergence, where the outcomes of consistent, Low visibility behaviors begin to differ significantly from those of more reactive or consumption-driven systems. And this divergence is often only noticeable when viewed over extended time horizons, which is why it can remain hidden in the short term. Ultimately, the idea of building wealth quietly is not about secrecy, but about structure. It is about designing a system that aligns with long-term objectives while minimizing unnecessary friction, distraction, and external pressure. And within that system, progress does not need to be constantly observed to be effective. It simply needs to be consistent. Because in financial systems governed by time and compounding, the most important processes are often the ones that operate without drawing attention, steadily shaping outcomes in the background while everything else remains unchanged on the surface. And when this system is extended further across time, an additional layer begins to emerge, one that is not immediately visible in the early stages, but becomes increasingly important as the structure matures, which is the interaction between quiet habits and cumulative system stability. In the beginning, each habit may appear isolated. Controlled spending, automated allocation, incremental optimization, these can all function independently. But over time, they begin to interlock. The gap between income and expenses feeds into automated systems. Automation reinforces consistency. Consistency amplifies compounding. And compounding, in turn, increases the scale at which even small optimizations begin to matter. This is where the system transitions from a collection of behaviors into a coordinated structure. Another subtle dynamic is the reduction of decision fatigue. When financial systems rely heavily on active decision-making, each choice introduces the potential for inconsistency. Emotions, external pressures, and short-term fluctuations can all influence outcomes. But when habits are designed to operate quietly and automatically, the number of decisions required over time decreases significantly. This does not eliminate the need for thinking, but it shifts thinking toward higher-level adjustments rather than constant micromanagement. And as a result, the system becomes more stable, not because conditions are controlled, but because the response to those conditions is more consistent. There is also a compounding effect of invisibility itself. When financial progress is not externally signaled, it avoids triggering behavioral responses that often accompany visible success. Increased spending, social comparison, expectation escalation, these are all mechanisms that can gradually erode progress. By remaining low visibility, the system reduces exposure to these pressures, allowing capital to accumulate without being offset by reactive behavior. In this sense, invisibility is not just a byproduct of the system, but a functional component of it. Over longer periods, another pattern begins to form, which is asymmetry between effort and outcome. In the early stages, the effort required to establish these habits may feel significant relative to the results. Progress appears slow. Changes are not immediately visible. But as time passes, the relationship begins to shift. The system requires less active effort to maintain, while the outcomes begin to accelerate due to compounding. This creates a phase where results increase without a proportional increase in effort, not because the system has changed fundamentally, but because time has amplified its effects. There is also the role of adaptability within a quiet system. Because the structure is not built around rigid, high-intensity actions, it can be adjusted more easily as conditions change. Income levels may shift. Expenses may evolve. External environments may become more or less favorable. And within a quiet system, these changes can be absorbed through gradual adjustments rather than disruptive overhauls. This flexibility is often overlooked, but it is one of the key reasons why such systems tend to persist over long periods. Another important layer involves the interaction between liquidity and long-term positioning. While a portion of capital is directed toward long-term growth, maintaining accessible resources creates a buffer that protects the system from shocks. This buffer allows adjustments to be made without interrupting the compounding process of long-term assets. And over time, this separation between short-term stability and long-term growth contributes to overall system resilience. There is also a feedback loop between stability and behavior. As the system becomes more stable, the need for reactive decision-making decreases. This leads to more consistent behavior. And consistent behavior further stabilizes the system. Over extended periods, this loop can reinforce itself, creating a structure where both the financial system and the behavioral patterns supporting it become increasingly aligned. From a structural perspective, what emerges is not a linear progression, but a layered system where each component supports the others. Spending control supports allocation. Allocation supports compounding. Compounding supports stability. Stability supports consistent behavior. And consistent behavior, in turn, maintains the entire structure. This interconnectedness is what allows quiet wealth-building systems to function effectively without requiring constant intervention. It also explains why disruption in one area can have cascading effects, and why maintaining balance across the system is more important than optimizing any single component in isolation. As the system continues to operate over time, another shift occurs, which is the transition from accumulation to optionality. In earlier stages, the focus is on building capital. But as that capital grows, it begins to provide flexibility. Decisions are no longer constrained in the same way. Choices can be made with a wider range of acceptable outcomes. And this flexibility is often the first externally meaningful effect of a system that has otherwise remained quiet. Yet, even at this stage, the underlying mechanics remain the same. The system continues to operate in the background. Habits remain consistent. Adjustments remain incremental. And visibility remains secondary to structure. Ultimately, what becomes clear through this extended view is that quiet wealth building is not defined by the absence of action, but by the nature of the actions taken. They're structured rather than reactive, incremental rather than extreme, consistent rather than intermittent. And over time, these characteristics allow the system to evolve in a way that is both stable and adaptive. Because in financial systems shaped by time, behavior, and compounding, the most significant outcomes are rarely the result of isolated events. They are the result of processes that operate continuously, often without drawing attention, gradually shaping the trajectory of the system until the difference becomes undeniable. And by the time that difference becomes visible, it is not the result of a single decision, but the cumulative effect of many quiet ones working together over time. And there is one final layer that further refines this perspective, which is how quiet systems interact with time not just as a multiplier, but as a filter. Over extended periods, time begins to separate consistent structures from inconsistent ones. Systems built on intensity, visibility, or short-term optimization tend to fluctuate because they rely on conditions that are difficult to maintain indefinitely. In contrast, systems built on quiet, repeatable behaviors tend to persist because they require less effort to sustain and are less sensitive to external disruption. This filtering effect is subtle but powerful. It does not operate in a single moment, but across years, gradually reinforcing what is stable and exposing what is fragile. Another dimension that emerges at this stage is the relationship between control and exposure. Quiet financial systems often reduce unnecessary exposure to volatility, not by avoiding risk entirely, but by structuring how and when that risk is taken. Because actions are deliberate and paced, the system is less likely to be overextended during uncertain conditions. And over time, this controlled exposure can lead to more stable outcomes, even if the underlying opportunities are similar. There is also a shift in how progress is measured. Instead of focusing on visible milestones or external comparisons, the system begins to be evaluated based on internal coherence. Are the components aligned? Is the structure functioning without friction? Is the system able to continue operating under changing conditions? These questions replace the need for constant validation, and in doing so, they reinforce the quiet nature of the process. And as this perspective takes hold, the role of patience becomes more defined. Not as passive waiting, but as active consistency. Each action may appear small in isolation, but within the system, it contributes to a larger pattern that unfolds over time. And because that pattern is not immediately visible, it requires a different kind of confidence, one that is based on understanding rather than immediate feedback. When viewed in its entirety, quiet wealth building becomes less about achieving a specific outcome and more about maintaining a system that can sustain itself. A system that does not depend on perfect timing, constant attention, or external recognition, but instead operates through alignment, repetition, and gradual adjustment. And within that framework, the absence of visibility is not a limitation. It is an advantage, because it allows the system to evolve without interruption, to compound without distraction, and to reach a point where the results, when they do become visible, are not the product of sudden change, but the natural consequence of a structure that has been